All right, so we are going to start the study of personality from the psychodynamic approach. And you already know the focus of that approach, right? The focus is unconscious influences, yes. So things that can affect your personality without your knowledge. Is that cool or what? We're going to be looking at 4 different psychodynamic theories, okay? And we're going to be spending a lot of time on this first one, on Freud's psychoanalytic theory. Don't try to write all these down. You'll have plenty of time to do that as we hit each one. But, just concentrate on this, because sometimes people say, no, not Freud. If you know anything about Freud's theory, yes, we are going to have to talk about sex. Okay? And why are we going to spend so much time on it? Well, I hope you come away with this with a whole new appreciation for Freud. Yes, his theory was based too much on sex for today. Although, hopefully you'll get a little better understanding of where he was coming from in his time. It was far more relevant. Hey, throughout this lecture, hopefully you'll get a better understanding of that. Hey, but I'm hoping that you all, by the end of this lecture, have a new appreciation for Freud really setting the foundation for the study of unconscious influences. So he really paved the way for a lot of interesting research that is still coming out today. Sometimes it's called implicit. Implicit thoughts, implicit attitudes, implicit feelings. Okay. In more modern language today, but it's all based on this idea that people, your personality and your behavior can be affected by things of which you are not aware. So we also going to be looking at 3 other psychodynamic approach theorists, although by the time we get to them, you probably forget that they're coming. We're going to be looking at Carl Jung's theory, at Adler's theory, and at Erikson's theory. Also, very interesting, very different than Freud's as far as, their specifics, but they all have one thing in common, all 4, and that is they are psychodynamic theorists, meaning that their main interest is that of the unconscious. Okay? So, one thing I want you to know about Freud, if you didn't know this already, is that really interesting story. He began working as a physician. Okay, so he began working as a physician in a hospital, and over time he started saying something to his colleagues, something really interesting. Okay, and what he was saying was, people seem to know things that they don't know they know. Okay, so oftentimes he's talking about his patients. They're in the hospital, but he's saying to his colleagues, they seem to know things that they don't know they know. That's such an interesting concept just to wrap your brain around, right? They seem to know things they don't know they know. So the focus here is going to be on the unconscious, and we're going to start with Freud's components of the personality. His theory regarding the components of the personality. A lot of you learned this in high school, but for some of you this might be brand new. Very interesting though, he proposed that there are 3 independent components of the personality. Independent, working separately, okay? And called the id, the superego, and the ego. Okay. Now, the main purpose of the id is seeking pleasure. Now, think about that. Really, if that was working all on its own, okay, and you did not have an ego or a superego, okay, that would be your only concern, is you would be out there seeking pleasure all the time at anybody else's expense. Okay, so it's good that clear that all personalities seek pleasure, that we all do this. It is a part of our personality, but fortunately there's more to us. We're going to skip down to this 3rd one here, superego. Okay, and this one So in the same way that the id is the pleasure principle, the superego is the conscience principle, or you might think of it as the morality principle. Okay? It's really going to help to balance that id, right? Is to have a good, strong superego too. So the superego is the conscience and helps to balance the id. But again, people tend to think of the id as a bad thing, the superego as a good thing. And that's not true. What's really important and good, okay, in an evaluative way is that you have both equally strength id and superego. I want you to stop and think about that for a moment. If all you had was an id, okay, this next weekend, you would spend the entire weekend partying and not get any studying done for your first test. If all you had was a superego, okay, you would spend the entire time studying at the expense of sleep and some play, which is good for you to take breaks, right? And so both of these are very necessary in a healthy personality, okay? But as you can imagine, there's going to be a lot of conflicts between these two, the id and the superego. So the ego is the reality principle. If you think about it, the ego is the only one that has its feet on the ground. It's based in reality. The id is kind of seeking pleasure all the time up in the clouds. The superego is not well attached to reality because functioning on its own, would not be healthy either. It doesn't have its feet on the ground. So the job of the ego is to mediate between these two. It's the only one that is based in reality, the reality principle. Sometimes people think of it as the mediating principle. I like to think of it as both. Okay. And, think about it. Somebody had an overdeveloped id and an developed or practically non-existent superego. It could go to the extent of somebody being a rapist or murderer or both. Somebody had a really overdeveloped superego and no id or very little id compared. Sometimes that can result in obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So again, these are all really powerful, necessary parts of the personality, but in a healthy personality, they all have equal strengths. All right. Now, Freud also, as you know, proposed the idea of the unconscious. Okay. So think about it. Freud was the first person to systematically come up with this idea and systematically attempt to pursue it. Could it be that people know things that they don't know they know? Now, sometimes we have trouble getting our brain around that. We think, well, if we know it, how could we not know it, right? But I know you've all experienced this one before. Have you ever studied something for a test, and then you're taking the test and you hit that, and you know it, but you just can't think of it, okay? There might be an example of something in the unconscious. But Freud proposed not just 2, but 3 levels of awareness, okay? And so let's take a look at these 3. Now, the conscious level of awareness. Okay, right now, you are conscious, hopefully, of me talking and of the material on the slide and the photo on the slide. That is all part of your conscious awareness right now, okay? So it's what you happen to be thinking of right now. That is your conscious level awareness. That is what we would say the content of your conscious mind right now. Okay? Pre-conscious is things that you could think of, but you're not thinking of right now. So they're not in your conscious mind, but you could easily get to them and pull them up in there if you were just given a cue. So let me give you a cue. What did you have for dinner last night? Now, most of you were able to answer that. And when you did, what you did was you took that information from the pre-conscious level and moved it up into the conscious level. Okay. And then the most interesting level of all. People seem to know things they don't know they know, the unconscious. And this is information that you know, but you cannot retrieve from memory and pull it into your conscious mind. If you think about it, this material in the unconscious can have even more of an effect on your personality, your thought processes, your behavior than material in the conscious mind. Because how can you fight it if you're not aware of it? If you can't bring it into the conscious mind, how can you refute it? How can you attack it using logic? Okay? So even if it's illogical, it can have a larger effect on your personality, your thought processes, your behavior. Really super cool, really interesting. Okay. Now, this is a great metaphor, and some of you have heard of what is called the iceberg metaphor, right? So Freud liked to use the iceberg as a metaphor for talking about these levels of awareness. And what he's trying to do is get the point across to you about how much content he feels, the percentage of content, for instance, that is in the unconscious mind, because he felt that far exceeded the rest. Okay. So what you've got here is he's showing the conscious content, like the amount of content that would be in your conscious mind is just the very tip of the iceberg. Okay. And then he's saying, that this point here up, is the preconscious. So you could draw it up above the surface easily, okay? But you don't happen to be thinking of it right now. And you'll see that that's a wider area here, okay? And then he talks about the unconscious, okay? And again, with the bulk of the material actually being in the unconscious. Now, what's interesting also about this particular picture is that it's showing you where those, according to Freud's theory, where those components of personality are housed. Okay? So Freud thought that the ego was pretty much housed in almost completely the conscious mind. Okay? That the superego is kind of in both the conscious and the preconscious mind, but that the id is almost entirely housed in the unconscious. Now, as you can imagine, there are going to be a lot of conflicts, as we said, between the id and what? It's a little test of your memory here, the id and the superego. There's a lot of conflicts between those two that the ego needs to manage, right? There's also a lot of potential for conflict between the conscious and the unconscious mind. So conscious thoughts and unconscious thoughts. Sometimes we become aware of unconscious thoughts having an effect on our behavior, for instance. And it can be hard for us to resolve that, and we need the help of the ego to resolve that. So, for instance, somebody might really think that they are not bigoted at all, but then kind of catch themselves sitting quite as far away as possible from somebody who's very different from them on the subway. That would be an example of that. So the ego's job is to resolve those conflicts that come up between the id and the superego, and also the conscious and the unconscious. And it gets some help in doing that.